Now it's time to look at the issue of privatisation, which is an integral part of this strategy to turn even more of this country and its economy over to being owned and or controlled by transnational corporations. National was so desperate to get back into power at the 2008 election that against all its own instincts it had to do what's called swallowing dead rats. It promised not to sell off any public assets in its first term in office, knowing full well of course there's never been a single term national government. That term finishes on November the 26th and already National has declared its hand. To nobody's surprise, a central plank of its policy, if re-elected, is the partial privatisation of a number of specified state-owned enterprises, namely the 4 major power generators, Solid Energy and Air New Zealand. John Key has made a big song and dance about how private ownership will be restricted to 49%, and he also promised that, quote, Kiwi mums and dads will be the target of the shares to be issued when those public assets will be floated. Neither of those promises stands up to any scrutiny. Commentators, including Key himself, have admitted that even if these mythical Kiwi mums and dads do buy the shares, there is nothing to stop them promptly selling them to the first big corporate buyer that comes along, either from New Zealand big business or much more likely a transnational corporation. That is exactly what happened in the 1990s to community-owned local electricity network operators. Shares were issued to their customers who promptly became the targets of offers they couldn't refuse from corporate buyers. This happened in Auckland. One case where share brokers set up a caravan in a supermarket car park to just buy up as people come out from doing their shopping. Nor does 49% private ownership provide any kind of protection. All you need to do is look at the Overseas Investment Act, which despite many amendments since it was first passed in 1973, still retains the same legal definition of a foreign company, one that is more than 24.9% foreign owned. It doesn't matter whether that percentage is held by one or many foreign owners. If it totals anything higher than 24.9%, it is recognised as a foreign company, and that's the law in New Zealand for the last 40 years. In other words, John Key is talking about accepting a level of private, inevitably foreign ownership, which is double the legal definition of a foreign company. So that's great protection, isn't it? And there is an inherently absurd contradiction in this whole Kiwi mums and dads nonsense. They already own these assets because that is what public ownership actually means. And wasn't that a hard one to work out? They have paid for them by their taxes. Why should they be expected to pay for them again by buying a few shares in them and diluting their ownership to the status of a minority shareholder? And let's take that one step further. What say these privatised corporations, what say one of them goes bust? So therefore Kiwi mum and dad suddenly becomes unsecured creditor, standing in the back of the queue behind the Australian-owned banks and the moneylenders, etc., for maybe what, 1, 2, 5, 10 cents on the dollar? So isn't that a bargain? From going from owning 100% of these things through public ownership to possibly standing in the queue as an unsecured creditor. Why does the government want to privatise public assets? Key and English are trotting out the tired old lie that it is to reduce debt. This was used, and I saw this in today's Listener editorial, and that's right, we need to, yes, this, I'm reading the latest Listener. This was used during the huge wave of state asset privatisations in the late 1980s and early 90s. It couldn't be justified then, and certainly can't be justified now. At least good old Sir Roger Douglas had the decency to tell the truth. In an early 1990s book, praising him and his cronies for the sell-off of state forests, I think I reviewed this when you were editor of the Journal, actually, Alistair, in the early 1990s. In an early 1990s book, praising him and his cronies for the sell-off of state forests, Douglas said, quote, I am not sure we were right to use the argument that we should privatise to quit debt. We knew it was a poor argument, but we probably felt it was the easiest to use politically, unquote. So that's directly from Roger Douglas. That's not from Helen Clark, that's not from Winston Peters, that's not from Materia Turai, that's from Roger Douglas. That's what he said, was how they justified flogging off public assets. New Zealand does have high foreign debt at present, but the great bulk of it is private debt, not public. Of that private foreign debt, around 70% is bank debt, which is only a problem for the Australian owners of our major banks, not the New Zealand taxpayer. Under Labour, public debt was substantially reduced as a matter of policy priority. That trend was reversed when the global financial crisis erupted and National started borrowing large sums to keep the economy afloat during very difficult times. So increasing public debt became a policy priority for National and a sensible one in the circumstances. As it is, New Zealand's public debt is very low compared to other high-income countries. It is certainly nothing like the public debt levels of countries such as we unfortunately name pigs, Portugal, Ireland, Greece and Spain. And this is where the listener today was saying, yes we are, we're similar to them. No, we're not actually. Countries with which the government is now comparing New Zealand in a propaganda drive to panic Kiwis into accepting there is no alternative to privatisation. Our public debt levels provide no justification for flogging off those assets. The answer to the question is, of course, that the government wants to privatise public assets for ideological reasons. Okay, let me move on. Right. The state-owned power companies, Solid Energy and Air New Zealand, are only the beginning. There is a well-advanced process of privatisation by stealth. Just to quickly summarise other affected sectors, there are public-private partnerships, or PPPs, being set up for infrastructure projects. I came past one the other day on the road from Whangarei to Auckland. There's a toll road now from Puhoi to Auckland. The extremely lucrative workplace component of ACC is being, quote, opened up to competition. The first contract is being let for a private prison to Serco, the British transnational. In the case of both ACC and prisons, these moves continue policies started by the 1990s national government and stopped by Labour. PPPs are being set up to run education sector infrastructure, buildings, and let's see if they move into content. And somebody pointed out at a meeting, I think in Palmerston North the other night, you have private prisons, and those companies have a vested interest in crime. Those companies have a vested interest in keeping, quote, bums on seats, or bodies in cells. And if you think, oh, this is a bit paranoid, there's a wonderful case in America within the last 12 to 18 months where a judge was actually caught out from accepting backhanders from the bloody owners of a private prison to sort of keep the numbers up. And so kids who sort of said, fuck you to the teacher or something, suddenly found themselves in prison because that was the way of keeping the numbers up. Juvenile delinquents being slammed in jail and the judge was getting money for getting a quota. So this is here. They have a vested interest in actually filling up people into their sort of institution. These are all privatisation moves underway right now. In the future, there is the very real prospect of Kiwi Bank being flogged off, and you can see what's happening with New Zealand Post right now. Not only is it ideologically unacceptable to the Tory privatisers, and Labour's leadership, in the person of both Clark and Cullen, sneered at it when they were forced to establish it as part of the coalition deal with the Alliance. I remember they both said they wouldn't put their money into it, but it is also, their personal money, but it is also an extremely successful and innovative bank, which is giving the big Aussie banks a run for their money at the lower end of the market. People ask, well, what's left to sell? Because so much has already been flogged off. The answer is plenty. Two huge sectors which the transnationals want to get their hooks into are water and local body services. Rodney Hyde went to all the trouble to restructure Auckland local government for the benefit of his big business mates, only to have the ungrateful voters deliver the wrong result and the wrong mayor. But the structure is now all in place for our biggest city to be run as a board of directors when a future more obliging mayor and council are in place. And why muck around with all this tiresome democracy nonsense? In 2010, the government simply sacked ECAN, Canterbury's regional council, and installed commissioners to run it. Dictatorships are so much more stable and predictable and deliver the desired outcome. So, okay, maybe one more. So what's wrong with privatisation? 3 examples should suffice. Telecom, the railways, Air New Zealand. You don't need me to spell out the details of all that was wrong with their respective privatisations. I refer you to our website, actually. Necessitating renationalisation in the case of 2 of them, the railways and Air New Zealand. People say, who cares who owns the power companies? The state-owned ones behave like bastards anyway. And don't I know it, I'm a customer of one of them, Meridian, but they did give us the transistor radio we could listen to in the dark when we had no power in February. Never listen to talkback radio again. True, but the solution is not to flog them off to the private owner of a private owner, but to enact a policy that state-owned companies supplying an essential service actually be a public service rather than profit-obsessed corporations, which are publicly owned whilst exhibiting all the worst characteristics of privately owned big business corporations. That requires a political decision to change the business model of those and other state-owned enterprises from profit to service. And that's hardly revolutionary. That was the status quo in this country until the mid-1980s, actually. That's what I grew up with. Both the railways and the post office could have been fixed, updated and recapitalised without needing to be flogged off. They are both textbook examples of what is called socialising the losses whilst privatising the profits. Now I'll put it in individual terms that all of us can understand. If you can't afford to pay your mortgage, you can always sell your house. Fine, you've cleared your debt and you've sold your asset. But that's a central contradiction, isn't it? By selling your asset, you've no longer got a house. And now you don't have the money to buy another house. So where will you live? And you could downsize to a smaller place. Now where could New Zealand downsize to? Maybe, I don't know, Sames Island. Or you could revert to becoming a tenant. And as we all know who has the power in the landlord-tenant relationship. Everybody in this room has been both a tenant and an owner. Or a lot of people in this room have been tenants and owners, and you don't need me to explain which one is the more preferable situation to be in. Ownership is power. This is recognised by none other than John Key, who has said that he doesn't want New Zealanders to become tenants in their own country. Well, he's doing his best to bring that about. And there is plenty that is right. Next one. There is plenty that is right with publicly owned assets. To quote from a Council of Trade Unions flyer entitled "If Privatisation is the Answer, What Was the Question?", they have many benefits, including preventing profiteering in important services with little competition, e.g. electricity, Kiwi Bank. Ensuring essential services are provided fairly and affordably, e.g. water, welfare, superannuation. providing security of services, e.g. electricity, coastal shipping, public transport. Social solidarity and services which are more efficient to provide universally, e.g. ACC, health. Providing services and development when the private sector doesn't, e.g. Air New Zealand, rail, solid energy, and providing additional income to the government, e.g. electricity, Kiwi Bank, solid energy, Air New Zealand. I speak from the personal experience of being a Christchurch earthquake victim, and I ask you all to reflect on where things would be at now if earlier governments, for example the Roger Douglas government, had decided to privatise the Earthquake Commission with its very tempting pot of billions of dollars just lying around doing nothing. How do you reckon the private sector would have gone if it was in charge of the whole operation in Christchurch right now? Well, the answer to that is not hypothetical, because there are whole categories of earthquake victims who are not covered by the EQC and who are reliant on their insurance companies for repair, rebuild and/or compensation. And no surprises here, these mostly foreign-owned insurers are principally concerned with getting a good return for their shareholders and not with providing a public service. A disaster of this magnitude can only be handled by the state, not the private sectors. There are plenty of private companies involved. I'm dealing with Fletcher's at the moment at our place, but they are operating under the direction of the state, which has the power to declare a state of national emergency and mobilise all necessary resources. And I'll emphasise, this is a core function of the state. A lot of things are just too big and important to be left to the private sector. Now sure, the EQC and the government, both at local and national level, could do some things better. But theoretically, at least, they are accountable to us, the voters, the people who pay their wages and who determine whether they keep their jobs or not. Private company people are only answerable to their boards of directors and shareholders. And we need to beware of what American writer Naomi Klein has identified as disaster capitalism. She was referring to what happened in the aftermath of the 2005 Hurricane Katrina catastrophe in New Orleans, which was George Bush's finest hour, where private firms took advantage of the circumstances to get their hands on various functions and activities previously performed by the state. At this point I'll ask you another question to see if you're awake for a start. Who is the second biggest landlord in New Zealand? It's the Christchurch City Council. So then the next sentence says, already Roger Kerr of the Business Roundtable has suggested that Christchurch's publicly owned assets, such as the power company, airport, port, buses, housing, etc., be fully or partly sold to help pay for the earthquake repair and rebuild. So when we say we're talking about the second biggest landlord in New Zealand, not the second biggest landlord in Christchurch, Christchurch City Council is the second biggest landlord in New Zealand after the state. Why? Because when the shrewd boys in Wellington and Auckland flogged off all the council houses back in the 80s and 90s, Christchurch didn't. Christchurch kept the houses. They have a portfolio of thousands of flats in the city. They're still building them, actually, to cater for mental patients tossed out of bloody hospitals by so-called community care initiatives. And that, so, I mean, they got so far up the nose of the bloody Business Roundtable, the Business Roundtable christened Christchurch City Council the People's Republic of Christchurch. Remember that stuff? And so good old Gary Moore and his council got printed in China T-shirts that said People's Republic of Christchurch. You can go to the City Council and get one free of charge. So when we say we're talking about that one aspect of Christchurch City assets alone is the second biggest landlord in the country, we're talking serious money. The Christchurch City Holdings Limited, which is the trading company for the whole City Council operations, is worth between $1 and $2 billion. So we're talking serious money. There's no suggestion, for example, from Roger Kerr that there should be, as the Greens have proposed, a levy of 1.5 cents on the dollar for high income earners. There's no proposal from Roger Kerr that, for example, that tax cuts should be reversed or that taxes should actually be increased, which is what the Time magazine article says is the answer, as demonstrated by those Scandinavian countries that are the top in the world for prosperity. No, Roger Kerr says flog off Christchurch's stuff, and just coincidentally, I'm sure, that will fall into the hands of the corporations that comprise the Business Roundtable. So that's their solution for sorting out the earthquake. Isn't it a good one? All of this, the TPPA, we'll move on, yep, that's it, move on, the TPPA and the privatisation of public assets is all just a part of the big picture, namely the relentless takeover of nearly every sector of the New Zealand economy you can think of by transnational corporations. It is in effect a recolonisation, but one by company rather than by country. Although you could argue that if the TPPA goes ahead, New Zealand will virtually be colonised by the US government and reabsorbed into the American empire. This whole subject is the reason for Kafka's existence and has been since we were founded back in the mid-70s. The various issues, battles and transnational corporations may have changed through those decades, although some have stayed exactly the same. I'm thinking of the mob that runs the Bluff aluminium smelter. But our underlying message is the same. We exist to expose and oppose all aspects of foreign control of Aotearoa. That's what our name says and that's what we mean. So now that's a huge subject in its own right, and I can spend even more hours giving a very detailed account of it, which is exactly what I did on some of my earlier speaking tours. We're all older now, and that would keep us up past our bedtime. So what I'd suggest you do is check out our material there on the websites. If you want to stay informed, join CAFCA at this meeting or when you get home tonight. So rush home and write a cheque. It's only $20. We'll take cheques even issued from foreign banks.